Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita. All right, so are you ready for this? We're going deep into wolf territory today.
Oh, I'm excited. Wolves are my thing. Always have been.
Well, perfect. Our listeners have been howling for an episode on the ethics of sharing space with large predators, specifically wolves and sheep farmers.
Yeah, it's a really hot topic, right?
Yeah.
Especially with wolf populations making a comeback in some areas.
Exactly. And to really get into the meat of this, we're diving into a paper called Multispecies, Ethics in Space, Coexisting with Wolves. It's based on some fascinating research in the French Alps.
Oh, yeah, the French Alps. Stunning region and a great case study for this kind of thing.
Right. I mean, it's a place where you have this incredible wildlife, like wolves, trying to coexist alongside people who've been raising sheep for generations. So how do you even begin to define coexistence in a situation like that?
Well, that's one of the things this paper does so well. It doesn't shy away from the complexity of it all. It digs into how we define coexistence itself and whose voices are included, or should I say, excluded from that definition.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a huge part of the ethical puzzle, isn't it? Like, whose perspective really matters when we're talking about managing wolves and the livelihoods of people who share the land with them?
Absolutely. And the paper uses this striking example. It's about a sheep breeder, right? He actually supports having wolves around, but because he doesn't live right in the heart of wolf territory, he gets labeled as an urban ecologist by people who want the wolves gone.
It's like they're using that urban versus rural divide to discredit his opinion.
Totally. You don't live here, so you don't get a say. It's like drawing a line in the sand.
But the paper also brings in another perspective, an NGO member who's connected to wolves, not through farming, but through their impact on tourism and hiking.
Right. Like they see the wolves as adding value to the region in a completely different way. Shows you how multi-layered this whole thing is.
Okay, so we've got this complex ethical landscape. And on top of that, you asked us to consider the sheep's point of view. And this paper actually does that in a really thought-provoking way.
Yeah, it challenges that simple predator versus livestock narrative.
It talks about how sheep often face a high risk of death during transport, sometimes even before they reach the farm.
It's true. I mean, the whole journey of those sheep, it's pretty intense, and it makes you think about well-being in a much broader sense.
There's this quote from a farmer who talks about how his lambs are shipped across multiple countries, sometimes spending a month in a truck. A month.
Wow. A whole month? I mean, that's a long time to be on the move in a cramped space.
It really makes you question where our responsibility lies when it comes to the welfare of these animals. Right?
For sure. It goes way beyond just protecting them from wolves. I mean, we're talking about the entire system of production and consumption here.
Absolutely. So this whole idea of coexistence needs to expand, right? It has to include the sheep's experience too. And this is where this concept of species spatiality comes in.
Yeah, species spatiality. Now, that might sound like a mouthful, but it basically boils down to, how we use space.
Right. How we organize and manage the spaces we share with other species can have a huge impact on how they behave.
And it's not always in predictable ways either.
The paper gives this really interesting example. It talks about a sheep breed from Eastern Europe, the Raka. And these sheep, they're tough, they've got these massive horns, and they're known for being able to fight off wolves. They're called wolf-killing sheep.
Wolf-killing sheep? I mean, come on, that's amazing.
Right. But here's the thing. In France, there's a push to breed sheep without horns. Makes them way easier to manage, but also way more vulnerable to wolf attacks.
It's like we've accidentally made sheep into easier targets for wolves. And this all comes down to us, doesn't it?
Yeah, this is about unintended consequences. We've shaped the sheep to fit our needs, but haven't fully thought through the consequences for their survival in a landscape where wolves exist.
Exactly. And it's not just about sheep and wolves, right?
Yeah.
It's about this whole complex dance between humans and nature, this back and forth, where every action has a reaction. Sometimes it's predictable, sometimes it's not.
And speaking of blurred lines, we have to talk about the whole dog versus wolf thing. I mean, sometimes dogs attack sheep, and those attacks get blamed on wolves.
Happens all the time. And sometimes people even deliberately misattribute dog attacks to wolves so they can get compensation from the government.
So, like, every layer we peel back, it reveals another layer of complexity. It's just layer upon layer here.
And it gets even more complicated when we start talking about the spatial rules around wolf culling.
Yeah, the paper mentions that in France, you can shoot a wolf if it's in immediate vicinity of a pasture. But what does immediate vicinity even mean?
Right. How do you define that? It seems incredibly vague.
It's a bit of a gray area, isn't it? I mean, is that really negotiation, as the paper calls it, or is it more like setting an arbitrary boundary?
That's a great question. A really great question. I mean, and then you've got all these other methods humans use to try and separate the wolves from the sheep, like fences and guard dogs and shepherds.
Those technical agentsments, as the paper calls them.
Fancy word, right. But yeah, it's all about creating barriers. But the paper also shows us that these barriers often fail. They don't always work.
It's like trying to control nature, and nature always finds a way to push back, right?
It does. It always does. Like they talk about sheep getting trapped inside enclosures and actually ending up more vulnerable to attack because they panic.
It's like we're creating problems by trying to solve problems.
Yeah. But before we get too doom and gloom here, the paper does highlight some really innovative solutions people are exploring.
Right. Like using pheromones to calm sheep. And they're even experimenting with heart rate monitoring to detect stress in the animals before things escalate.
It's pretty amazing what they're coming up with.
Yeah.
It's like, it gives me a little bit of hope that we can find ways to make this whole coexisting thing work a little better.
So to recap, we've delved into how we define coexistence, explored the ethical dilemmas surrounding sheep transport and the complexities of spatial boundaries, and looked at both the failures and innovations in managing those human-wolf interactions.
Woo! It's a lot to take in, but it's so important to have these conversations,
Absolutely. And there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to explore, a perspective that might just turn everything we've talked about on its head.
Ooh, I love a good plot twist.
Yeah.
You're talking about that post-human perspective, right?
You got it. And that's where we're headed next in our deep dive. Buckle up. All right, so we left off talking about this post-human perspective. What is that all about?
It's like, okay, imagine a farmer, right? And this farmer, he doesn't view the wolf as like the enemy or anything. He just sees it as like a neighbor, one he has to figure out how to live with.
So instead of trying to control the wolves all the time, he kind of just accepts that they're there.
Exactly, like they're part of the landscape, a given.
Does the paper actually give any examples of this? Like real-life farmers who are doing this?
Yeah, it does. There's this one farmer, and he sees wolves as just part of his work, like a force of nature he's got to adapt to constantly.
So he's not into fences and enclosures and all that?
Nope. He's like, forget the hard boundaries. He knows those wolves are smart, and they'll just find ways around our human rules anyway.
It's like he's saying wolves will be wolves, and he's just got to work with that.
Exactly. He's not trying to dominate nature. He's trying to find a way to coexist, even if it's kind of messy and unpredictable.
Does it work? Like, does he lose a lot of sheep?
Well, sometimes, yeah. But the thing is, he's willing to think again after each encounter, especially if he loses a sheep. He sees it as a learning experience.
Wow, so he doesn't just throw his hands up in frustration.
No, not at all. He even goes as far as to say that if a wolf takes one of his sheep, it just means the wolf was smarter than him that time.
That's pretty humbling.
Right. And it's such a different mindset from seeing wolves as just pests to be eradicated.
It kind of reminds me of that idea we talked about earlier, how people use spatial boundaries to shut out certain perspectives. This post-human approach seems to be all about breaking down those boundaries.
Totally. It's like we're all in this together, humans and wolves, the whole shebang.
So how do we take this big philosophical idea, this post-human thinking, and actually put it into practice? Coexisting with wolves is hard.
Oh, for sure. It's messy. Tons of challenges. It's that whole tension between our human desire for order and control and the reality that nature just doesn't play by our rules.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, right? It just doesn't work.
Exactly. But maybe that tension, that discomfort, that's where the real work lies.
Meaning what? Like we need to be more okay with being uncomfortable?
Maybe. I think it's more about being willing to constantly question our assumptions and adapt our approach. And that can be uncomfortable, but it's how we learn and grow.
This whole conversation is making me think. If this post-human perspective works with wolves, could it work in other areas where humans and nature are clashing? Like, could this apply to other conservation efforts?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Okay.
This paper is specifically about wolves and sheep, but it gives us this model for how to think about coexistence on a much bigger scale.
And we started with trying to understand the ethics of it all, and now it's almost like, whoa, we're talking about the human condition.
It's true. We're talking about how humans relate to nature and even how we relate to each other. It's all connected.
So this deep dive is a journey into the heart of coexistence. We've looked at boundaries, those spatial dynamics, and now this post-human way of thinking.
And the big takeaway, Coexistence isn't some destination. It's an ongoing process, a constant negotiation, a dance we got to learn to do, and be willing to change the steps as we go.
It's a great way to put it.
And it requires us to be open to new ideas, be willing to listen, and most importantly, be okay with not always having the answers.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I mean, we've gone from wolves and sheep to, like, the human condition.
It's been quite the journey, hasn't it? And it's just the beginning.
Right, and before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought. We've been talking about wolves as this physical presence out there in the wilderness, but what if we thought about them as a symbol?
Ooh, I like where you're going with this.
A symbol of the wild, of those parts of nature that we're constantly trying to control or, I don't know, maybe even suppress.
It's like you're asking, what happens when we try to get rid of the wolf inside ourselves?
Right.
Like, what do we lose when we try to deny those wild, untamed parts of our own human nature?
Right. And maybe, just maybe, if we can figure out how to coexist with wolves in the mountains, we can also figure out how to
Maybe the key to finding a more balanced way of being in the world.
You know, that idea of the wolf within, it's really sticking with me. It makes you think about all those, like, untamed parts of ourselves. Those instincts and desires we're always trying to control.
It is a pretty powerful metaphor.
It really ties into everything we've been discussing in this deep dive.
Right.
Remember at the beginning we were trying to unpack the ethics of sharing space with wolves, especially for sheep farmers. And we've come so far beyond that initial question, haven't we? This research is giving us a framework for understanding not just multi-species coexisters, but like the whole human condition.
It really is mind-blowing when you think about it.
We started by examining how we even define coexistence and how something as basic as where you live can be used to include or exclude your voice from that conversation.
Yeah, we saw that with the sheep breeder who supported wolves, but was dismissed as an urban ecologist simply because he didn't live right in the thick of it.
And then we got into all the spatial dynamics, right? How sheep and wolves and even the farmers themselves move and interact and create this whole web of relationships.
And we realized that the predator versus livestock narrative is way too simplistic. It's not that black and white.
There are so many shades of gray.
Exactly. And then we encountered that post-human perspective with that farmer who sees the wolf not as an enemy, but almost like a dance partner.
He just accepts that they're part of the landscape and he has to adapt.
Yeah, he's not trying to control the wolves or eliminate them. He's trying to figure out how to live alongside them.
And he's willing to learn from every encounter, even the ones where he loses sheep.
He sees it as an ongoing process, this constant dance of give and take.
It's like he's embracing the messiness of it all.
Exactly. And that's such a powerful lesson for all of us, isn't it? This whole deep dive has been about expanding our understanding of what coexistence really means.
And it's not just about our relationship with nature, it's about how we relate to each other too, right?
Absolutely. Think about all the conflict we experience in our lives. Disagreements with our families, clashes with colleagues, political standoffs. We often approach these situations with this need to be right, to control the outcome.
Yeah, it's like we want to dominate the conversation instead of really listening.
Exactly. And what if instead of trying to silence or overpower those who disagree with us, we try to understand their perspective? What if we acknowledge that they have just as much right to exist and express themselves as we do?
That would require a huge shift in thinking, wouldn't it?
It would, but I think it's the key to finding a more peaceful and sustainable way to live on this planet.
We've come a long way in this deep dive, haven't we? We've explored the ethics of space, the complexities of boundaries, and the transformative power of the post-human perspective.
And we've learned that coexistence is not a passive state of being. It's an active practice, a continuous process of engagement, negotiation, and a willingness to embrace the messiness of it all.
So as we wrap up this episode, we're going to leave you with a question to ponder. How can you practice coexistence in your own life? How can you navigate those boundaries, those conflicts, those shared spaces that connect us all?
Remember, the wolf is not just out there in the wilderness. It's also within each of us, a force that can be both destructive and creative. So embrace its presence, learn from its wisdom, and find ways to coexist, not just with wolves, but with all the wild and untamed aspects of yourself and the world around you.
That's a beautiful thought.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.